everyone. Welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, a recently signed U.S. defense bill allowing military exchanges with Taiwan does not sit well with China, adding to the uncertainty in Sino-U.S. relations. And Israel downplays a UN resolution condemning settlement in the Palestinian land, while pressing ahead with more settlement construction. And we start today's show with a bump in the road, at least for China-U.S. relations. American presidents like to announce major arms sales to Taiwan when they're about to leave office. George H.W. Bush, $8 billion. Bill Clinton, $2 billion. George W. Bush, $6.4 billion. And in the final year of President Obama from the U.S., his administration went beyond just arms sales, apparently. Last Friday, Mr. Obama signed a defense policy bill into law. For the very first time, it included a section on senior military exchanges with Taiwan, even though some argue it is not legally binding, but still a lot of repercussions. We will talk about what it means for Sino-U.S. ties, but first, take a look at this.
It's a controversial U.S. Defense Act with an unprecedented Taiwan section. If carried out, the senior military exchange program will happen at least once each year in both the United States and Taiwan. The Chinese Foreign Ministry was staunchly opposed, saying they've lodged a strongly worded complaint with the U.S.
Although the Taiwan-related content in the U.S. Act has no legal binding force, it still severely violates the three joint communiques and interferes in China's domestic affairs. China will by no means accept this. We urge the U.S. side to honor its commitment on the Taiwan question, put an end to military exchanges with and weapon sales to Taiwan, and avoid undermining China-U.S. relations or cross-strait peace and stability.
The People's Republic of China and the United States issued a joint communique in Shanghai in 1972, where both sides vowed commitment to the One China policy. It was followed by the joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1979. Then in 1982, the third communique was signed to settle the question of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. But there was contradiction. Earlier in 1979, the U.S. signed the Taiwan Relations Act, authorizing the Pentagon to sell arms to Taiwan legally. But what concerns China most may not be the growing arms sales from the U.S. to Taiwan. Earlier this month, President-elect Donald Trump talked on the phone with Taiwan leader Tsai Ing-wen. Although it remains to be seen how the new administration under President Donald Trump will act on the Taiwan section of the act, the new administration's unknown policy is a serious concern to China. And the so-called senior military exchange will just fuel tensions between the two countries, a tough challenge to their new model of big power relationship.
And for more discussion on the U.S. National Defense Authorization Act, we are joined in our Beijing studio Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies, also in Beijing, Mr. Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University. Originally, he's a journalist coming from the United States. Welcome to both of you. We are, at the time, also waiting for one panelist coming to join us from Taipei. For now, may I have the first question for both of you, gentlemen? How should we understand, Rick, I want to go to you because you covered the Hill as well as the White House when you were in Washington. Such a defense bill in which one section dealt with a non-legal binding sentence which states the U.S. Congress tendency of having more military exchanges between Taiwan and the United States.
Right. The Defense Authorization Bill sets policy. This is not any official policy. It's thrown in like a high school debate club. This is they're saying, we believe this. It doesn't have any force of law. When I was covering the Texas legislature before I came to Washington in the 1980s, they would pass these same non-binding resolutions saying that Washington should do this, Washington should do that, and people in Washington ignored it. The problem is this is a very sensitive international issue, and just by bringing up the topic, it complicates U.S.-China relations and really puts the government of Taipei on the spot.
Mr. Yang, you used to work in the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. So I would assume many of your work efforts still have to do with Taiwan issue, which is the most fundamental principle between China and the United States. Have you, in your experience, ever experienced a defense bill in which senior military exchanges between Taiwan and the United States in non-legal binding or legal binding way ever been raised in the defense bill?
Well, most of the, almost all bills and sections are non-binding. However, that produced lots of huge political influences on China-U.S. relation, because sometimes this Taiwan issue, especially relating to military items like arms sale exchanges, always trigger crisis between Washington and Beijing.
Right.
So we always, that is more important and sensitive and explosive issues. But by this time, I mean the latest Authorization Act, that is the first time to upgrade the so-called exchanges between Taiwan and Washington D.C. Military personnel exchanges at the small senior level than before. This is the first time. For example, for military person, this is the first time to upgrade that the people involved in exchanges can be at a general level. So that is the first time.
All right.
And the officials can be at the assistant secretary of level.
Okay. Well, one of the things the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman today stated is that China already filed a protest to the United States government, but at the same time take note of the fact that it is not necessarily legal binding. And yet, the question is, what's next? Because we know that we are in the time in which there is two administrations, one going out and one coming in. So why this timing? What does it mean for President Obama and his relations with the Capitol Hill? As we all know, he did not enjoy much happy hours even, with the Capitol Hill. And why would, in this NDAA this time, particularly put into this sentence, which has been the sense of the Congress, not necessarily the sense of the White House from day one?
Well, remember, he is a lame duck. President Obama is in his final month. Congress sent this to him. The president is against it. But there is so much in the legislation that has to be passed. That this is what Congress does when you have an opposition party in control of Congress. They put in things that the president doesn't like because the president has to sign the overall, the big bill. And so they push him. I think what's important now is what the next president will do. And Donald Trump is acting like he's president already. He's rewriting U.S.-China policy, and he's rewriting the history of Taiwan's place in the one China policy. And that's what's important. I think we really need to look at what Donald Trump says and then what he does in the next month.
Does this mean there's already a seed being planted in the NDAA by the current president, President Obama, even though he does not enjoy much friendship with the incoming president-elect, Mr. Trump, about the Taiwan issue, which Mr. Trump could maneuver and also manipulate to whatever extent that he wants? Why there has been apparently a cooperative effort between these two men, even though they have not enjoyed much common grounds on many other policies?
I think this is a bit more complicated than that, because President Obama is against that. But if he vetoed the legislation just because of a non-binding section of it, it would cause a firestorm politically, and it would inflame the situation with China more. So I think it was sort of defensive that he did this. I don't think it was Obama planning together with Trump.
Well, we're not suggesting any planning together, but apparently it could be a co-op when you look at the future possibilities. So, Mr. Yang, is China ready for this?
Well, I'm not sure whether or not China has been fully ready, but I'm sure China has been having such a way of thinking to meet any serious challenge triggered by Washington, D.C., especially the upcoming President Trump, because he has sent several quite dangerous signals to
But you
Beijing.
know, Mr. Yang, the interesting thing is earlier China dismissed what Mr. Trump said because he's not in the White House yet. He's not the president. He's not part of the government yet. So China take note of what he said and yet do not take necessarily seriously because he is not the U.S. president. And yet this time we see the current U.S. president, likely or not, he already signed into bill non-binding phrases regarding the senior level military exchanges. And then the incoming president is already in his Twitter talking about breaking the basic principle of U.S.-China relations, which is China-Taiwan issue. So the question is China ready in any way to negotiate on the Taiwan issue? Can they push the boundaries or push the envelopes on this issue to China?
Well, China can negotiate many issues with the United States, but Taiwan is a non-negotiable issue. That is China's internal affairs. Taiwan issue fundamentally is resulted from unfinished civil war. If U.S. want to trouble this issue, I'm afraid on one hand, the internal fights between mainland and Taiwan will reoccur. And on the other hand, the crisis between China and the U.S. will re-rise. That will damage every party. So we on one hand, we have to continue our preparation for the worst scenario. But meanwhile, we keep sending signals to Washington, no matter it's an existing administration or upcoming administration.
Liaoning aircraft carrier right now is in the South China Sea. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman dismissed the fact that there has been any link between the sales of the Liaoning aircraft carrier and other guarding vessels at this moment. She talked about it as freedom of navigation and overflight in respect to the international law. But is this, many would ask, a gesture China sent to the United States and also the mainland sent to Taiwan about the possible conflict, further build up in the region?
Well, I think due signals inside of these actions. On one hand, it's a really routine surveillance according to the international law, practicing the freedom passages. But on the other hand, the timing means something. Say, if there's going to be a crisis, then Liaoning vessels plus the other activities are part of our preparations you mentioned.
Mr. Denham, therefore, how much do you think Washington should play the card of Taiwan? Let's just say it from the political sense. How smart is it, whether for a leaving president or an incoming president, to play the card of Taiwan vis-a-vis, some would assume, the second largest economy of the world, and also the United States trading partner, and one country that the U.S. just have to deal with, China?
From the departing president's standpoint, it makes no sense to inflame a crisis in the final month. From the incoming president's point of view, it's important because I think he wants to use Taiwan as a bargaining chip in the debate over trade. The problem is that he could create a military or diplomatic crisis that overshadows it. I think he's thinking like a businessman, and that the Taiwan card is the one that would get the biggest reaction out of the government in Beijing. And so he thinks that he can play that to get better terms in trade deals. But that's a big gamble. I mean, that's a huge gamble, because it has been so fundamental to the China-U.S. relationship since 1972, the one China policy. And by even bringing that up, it could destabilize the entire relationship that's been built over the past 40-some years.
It is not just the issue of Taiwan, but also why this issue has become part of the NDAA, the Authorization act itself and where the United States is going at this critical juncture in terms of its military budget, we want to take a look at some of the details of this bill that just signed by the White House, of course, already passed by the Congress. The U.S. fiscal year 2017 military budget, it authorizes a total of more than $618 billion in spending, including a troop pay raise of 2.1%. It also calls for 3.2% more in base defense funding that Mr. Obama has requested, plus an additional $5.8 billion in White House requested war dollars. A lot of these have to do with the building of submarines, aircraft carriers. There has been a dramatic number of increase in the building of this. In fact, already contracted out to the military manufacturers. So many ask that question, Mr. Dunham. Of course, U.S. economy is just recovering. It is also a change of administration. Why spend so much? This is already 3 times bigger than China's national defense budget, 6 times bigger than Russia's defense budget. Is that really in the U.S. interest?
Well, the Republicans are pushing this for political reasons, and they're doing it because they can. They have the votes. But in terms of the spending, the U.S. defense spending has been rather flat, other than the continuing warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. But now you can see this is the beginning of an acceleration that we will see. Donald Trump has promised huge increases. I mean, no, there is not any reason that it would be 6 times the defense spending of China or Russia. It's just that the United States is thinking from a baseline, and Republicans want to do that.
Right.
They think it will stimulate the economy as well as stimulating the national
There
defense.
would always be an internal political argument for one reason or another for that. But when you look at it the diplomatically or through foreign relations sense, that's of course a very different story. December the 25th, the day just passed, already is the 25th anniversary of the dissolve of the former Soviet Union. The end of Cold War, and yet that war did not end beautifully. So when you look at the increase of military budget, particularly on a global scale, many are afraid of a new round of arms race. Nobody wants to see that because that's going to destroy our world. And nobody wants to see further build up the nuclear weapons. And yet, this has been called by the president-elect in the United States. Mr. Yang, your judgment here, what does the U.S. have in mind at this moment? Do you think, strategically thinking, this is just a hiccup of transformational policies, or this is really a whole change of mentality since the end of the Cold War?
Well, I think the old war has been over for decades long. However, the mindset of the United States politicians remain unchanged. They always enjoy the supreme advantages, military advantages over any powers in the world. So in recent years, especially during the past 10 years, the gap, military gap between U.S. and other major powers, for example, U.S., Russia, U.S., China, the gap is getting smaller. So I think this is the big background for the rebalancing of the defense budget, especially under Trump administration. Actually, he has called for increasing the military strength, both by the amount and the quantity and the quality. And he even raised the slogan, say, peace through strength. I'm afraid such a way of thinking will lead to a new round of Cold War.
We are not sure whether Make America Great Again through military buildup is really the way. We'll see how they are reacting in the months and weeks to come. For now, we are also joined on the phone by Ms. Joanna Lei, former legislator and chief executive officer of the Changhua 21st Century think tank. Joanna, thank you for waiting and welcome to our program. I really want to have your say here from Taiwan's perspective. You're in Taipei. Tell us about, at this moment, how people are debating about the recent U.S. move in Taiwan. Of course, there has also been responses coming from some members of Taiwan authorities saying it is looking very closely the movement of the Liaoning and also likely to respond if necessary. What does all of these rhetorics mean coming from the Tsai Ing-wen authorities?
Well, if we put all the pieces of the puzzles together, including the move by the United States, by Japan Abe administration, and also the recent visit of Carrier Liaoning in the West Pacific, we are looking at a military regime very close or similar to the 1970s. During that time, I think people remember our region was not under peace and stability regime. It was during time with different hostility and potential of war or brink of war was still rampant. So in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen's administration certainly welcomed the move by Obama, saying that the Section 1284, even though it's non-binding, it fully shows the United States' concern and support for Taiwan's defense, safety, and bilateral military exchanges. However, on the other hand, lots of people argue that the best route to peace and stability across Taiwan Strait is still the goodwill across the street between the two regimes. And certain move made by the United States using Taiwan as a bargaining chip will not benefit Taiwan, and in fact will be detrimental to the well-being of Taiwan. So there is an internal debate on what all these mean. But if you put everything together, the puzzle is looking dangerously close to the 1970s when we were not in peace and stability.
Ms. Lei, you are very close to many of the thinkers in Taiwan. Help us to understand what level already does the discussion take place? Can Taiwan afford to be a card played by the United States, whether it's the leaving president or the incoming administration?
Well, certainly the worst possible position is for Taiwan to be used just as a bargaining chip or a lever, because when both sides want to exert pressure on the other side, Taiwan will be the party receiving the most amount of pressure. However, there are people who believe that the more useful, quote unquote, we are to the United States or to Japan, the more we can count on them to support and defend Taiwan should there be any problem across Taiwan Straits. And the most recent bill that's signed by Obama allows the visits of generals, flag officers, and even people from the Pentagon above assistant secretary level to visit Taiwan. And this has not happened since 1970s. So a lot of people are inexperienced in terms of what this kind of military exchanges and cooperations would really mean, but certainly the gesture has irked a lot of people and stirred a lot of discussions locally.
Thank you so much for joining us, Joanna Lei. We are really appreciating your joining our discussion. Final words from both of you, food for thought for our audience who are looking at the changes going on right now, almost on a day-by-day basis on the Taiwan issue. Rick, you want to go first?
Well, I think the point that we've made, Taiwan should not be a bargaining chip. It's a very dangerous position if it's put in the middle, not because the United States cares about the future of Taiwan, but it is used for leverage on China. I think that's just very dangerous militarily and economically.
Mr. Yang?
No matter what kind of uncertainties Trump administration will bring about into the China-U.S. relation, the best way is keep Taiwan issue in certainty, leave them alone with Chinese, leave this issue for Chinese. They can solve this issue by themselves.
Right, that has been the principle from the very beginning, from day one, in fact, in 1979. Thank you so much, Rick Dunham, Yang Xiyu. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The UN Security Council minces no words in condemning illegal Israeli settlements, but Tel Aviv is defiant. Experts weigh in after the break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you Monday to Friday on CCTV News. The United Nations Security Council has demanded that Israel stop building settlements in Palestinian territory in a resolution passed last Friday. The United States refrained from vetoing the resolution, condemning its closest Middle East ally. Israel condemned the UN resolution and slammed President Obama for refusing to veto it. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had said that Israel will reassess its ties even with the United Nations.
The United Nations Security Council has passed a landmark resolution demanding a halt to all Israeli settlement construction in the occupied territories, which Palestine marked a day of victory.
This is a day of hope, a day of peace. This is a victory for those who believe in peace, who believe in the two-state solution.
The issue is one of the most contentious between Israel and the Palestinians. For decades, Israel has been building Jewish settlements on territory captured in the 1967 war with its Arab neighbors. The settlements are considered illegal under international law, though Israel disputes this. This time, the resolution was passed after the U.S. abstained, breaking with long-standing American practice. Washington traditionally used its veto power to shelter Israel from condemnatory resolutions.
Because the United States does not agree with every word in this text, that the United States did not vote in favor of the resolution. But it is because this resolution reflects the facts on the ground and is consistent with U.S. policy across Republican and Democratic administrations throughout the history of the State of Israel that the United States did not veto it.
Israel has scored the UN Security Council vote and called the U.S. decision to abstain as shameful.
The decision taken at the UN yesterday was part of the swan song of the old world bias against Israel. We are entering a new era, and as the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump said yesterday, this is going to happen much quicker than people think.
Netanyahu had tried to prevent the vote by appealing to U.S. President-elect Donald Trump, who tweeted calling for a U.S. veto on the resolution and persuading Egypt, who drafted the resolution, to postpone the vote. However, New Zealand, Malaysia, Senegal, and Venezuela requested to schedule the vote on Friday. Israel has recalled its ambassadors to New Zealand and Senegal in protest.
For more discussion on the Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, we are joined in our Beijing studio Li Guofu, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Also joining us once again in our Beijing studio, Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, an American journalist coming from the United States. In Tel Aviv, we are joined by Mr. Mir Javidanfar, who is a lecturer and analyst on Middle East. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen, to our program. First of all, I want to make very clearly the goal of our discussion. It is more focusing on the Israeli and the U.S. ties rather than the Israeli and the Palestinian disputes, because it would take us years to resolve that dispute. But rather, we want to focus on the latest development. Having cleared that, gentlemen, you all know what I'm talking about here. So let me ask you, Mr. Dunham, what do you make from the American perspective, this consensus internationally reflected by this adoption of resolution at the United Nations toward the Israeli and the Palestinian conflict?
The United States has had an intentionally ambiguous position on the settlements. It has agreed with the majority of countries in the world that these are improper and has condemned when additional settlements are built. However, as the chief ally of Israel and chief defender at the United Nations, it tries to prevent inflammatory resolutions or action. And in this case, I think it was a sign of the very weak relationship between the outgoing President Barack Obama and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think it was a parting shot, a message that was sent from the Obama administration.
Is this, Mr. Javidanfar, a turning point, or obviously two gentlemen who do not like each other and each other's way of doing things?
Well, there are two schools of thought, as my colleague in the studio said. I think, yes, that's one school of thought, that this was a parting shot by President Obama. His relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu has been bad from the get-go since they met 8 years ago. I think the first time they met in November, when President Obama was elected 8 years ago, which was in November 2007. 2008, Prime Minister Netanyahu already had a situation where President Obama stood him up in the White House because Israel had declared that it was going to build settlements just before Prime Minister Netanyahu came, and then there was another incident when Vice President Biden arrived in Israel, and in the same day declarations were made. So yes, on the one hand there's a question that the relationship between the two of them is not good, and that this was President Obama basically settling scores, but there's the other school of thought which says President Obama wants to make sure that the peace process or some kind of a contribution to the peace process stays as part of his legacy, which is why he took a step against the settlements with these actions at the United Nations Security Council.
Let's go back once again to Mr. Denham about the U.S. view. That legacy is very interesting because every American president from Bill Clinton seemed to want to make a mark about that. Of course, they all have different degrees of legacy regarding that, but how much will this mean for President Obama? How much will this really mean for the U.S. policy toward Israel?
Well, I think when it came to legacy, President Obama wanted to change U.S. policy with Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and in Israel and Palestinian state. And two of them were failures. Two of them were somewhat successful. I think that that this is something the outgoing president would like to do, would like to contribute to the peace process, but he's been frustrated from the beginning on that. There has to be a two-state solution if there's going to be a settlement, and the settlements in the occupied territory are a key problem.
But the question is, how long will that legacy last if it could be termed as a legacy by President Obama? Mr. Lee, we all know there's a change of administration, and almost every piece of news we're seeing today in our world is being shaped in one way or another by that fact of change of administration in one of the most powerful countries of the world. So what does it mean for the incoming president? President-elect Donald Trump, he's already very pro-Israel. Some of the remarks he made recently since being elected as the President of the United States almost resemble word by word with what Prime Minister Netanyahu said not long ago. Mr. Lee, what do you make of it?
I think, as you correctly said, the President-elect, Mr. Trump, is very much a pro to Israel. And not only about his speeches during the campaign, but after he has been elected.
Right.
And he also appointed, the future U.S. ambassador to Israel is also very much a pro to Israel. And they're even calling, the U.S. embassy to move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is something, the international community, I think, would not accept it, because that would undermine the whole process of peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians.
Right.
What I'm thinking, the timing is, Obama is trying to prevent, the incoming president to do something may undermine the process, also may to hurt the fundamental interests of the United States.
But let's see some of the reactions already coming from Israel. Israel pressed ahead with the construction of settlements in the year 2016, and now probably even more and more urgently. So far, 1,506 housing units have been approved for construction in East Jerusalem, compared to 775 units in the year 2014, and only 395 units in the year 2015. The Jerusalem Local Planning and Construction Committee is expected on Wednesday to approve permits to build furthermore 618 apartments in Jewish neighborhoods across the Green Line. So, Mr. Jevan Danfar, what does this mean for Prime Minister Netanyahu? Does this give him more momentum to move ahead even faster about the plan? Can he do it without considering at all the international community's consensus reflected by the United Nations, and at all about the further actions coming from the United Nations at this moment?
To answer that question, I first have to address what is a priority for any leader in a country, especially especially one such as Israel, where we have a coalition government. The priority number one is to stay in power. Now, as long as building extra settlements maintains the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu, maintains the stability of the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu, he'll keep doing it. He will continue because he's under pressure from more right-wing elements within the government, such as the Beit Yehudi party headed by Mr. Naftali Bennett. Now, the question is, now to answer your questions, how long can he continue building? Well, as long as the international pressure is not going to threaten the stability of his government, then I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to stop. I think for him it's more important to stay in power. But the moment international pressure starts threatening the stability of his government, then he's likely to change. Now, the next question, if I may pose it myself,
go ahead.
Is that when is that likely to happen? And that's likely to happen when, unfortunately, this boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign in Israel becomes serious, because the boycott campaign against Israel feeds on extra settlements. So as long as Netanyahu is building more settlements, the boycott campaign against Israel will feed on it and will become stronger.
Right.
And the moment that campaign becomes so strong that the opposition in Israel can use it against Netanyahu to topple his government, then that's the moment he's likely to stop.
Okay. At this moment, I've also been having some other information, and Mr. Javad Danfar, that is the French Peace Initiative that many of us have been talking about over the past few months, if not years. That is, by January the 15th, likely, United Nations Security Council members once again come up with another initiative urging Israel to halt its efforts to build more further settlement. That is before the U.S. President, Mr. Trump, comes into office on January the 20th. All of this time, very sensitive. So how do you think, is there any strategy that Prime Minister Netanyahu will be able to navigate this from now until the 15th, and from the 15th, if adopted by the UN, toward the 20th? Very briefly from you, Mr. Javad Danfar.
Well, that's an excellent question. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is not counting the days, but is literally probably counting the seconds until President Obama leaves the office. There's great concern here that yes, as you said, even with days before he leaves office, there could be another resolution against the state of Israel. What can Prime Minister Netanyahu do? Well, he can, from now until then, use some of the pro-Israel groups in America, such as the AIPAC lobby, to pressure Obama. But as he's leaving office, it's unlikely that he will take notice because he's got nothing to lose. I think what Prime Minister Netanyahu is likely to do instead is to already start talking with President Trump to come up with ways to neutralize the remnants or the ramifications of these new resolutions. For example, if these new resolutions at the UN Security Council could make it easier to impose sanctions against Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu probably is already working with, incoming President Trump to make sure that there will be laws in the Congress that basically says whoever imposes sanctions against Israel could be punished. That could be one way. Or to create other resolutions in the United Nations Security Council to cancel, to neutralize these resolutions.
But according to Samantha Powell, of course, the current U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she said this is consistent, the U.S. abstained from the vote. With a bipartisan consensus that she said goes back to Ronald Reagan. Mr. Dunham, what do you think of this specific quote and the inside the United States debates, political debates?
Well, it's slightly disingenuous. Yes, there has been a bipartisan consensus against additional settlements, but this is unprecedented for the United States to allow a resolution like this to pass. And in terms of American politics, if Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to have any influence on the Obama White House in the final days, he has to work with pro-Israel Democrats to have them put pressure on the White House, because he has absolutely no leverage directly.
All right. Mr. Li, you're a longtime observer of U.S.-Israeli ties. You see this being going some bumpy road, but not as bumpy as this time. So what would this necessarily mean for the incoming administration? How much political air can he really enjoy by further push toward the Israeli side of this relation? And what would countries like China and other permanent Security Council members actually think about and move ahead with some of the further actions and resolutions?
I think when the incoming President Trump, once he was set in the White House, he will think more broadly. And almost, I'm not going to say he will totally forget about what he said during the campaign, but the priority or what he thinks most is how to expand in American interests. And because this is the international consensus, and if he is going to do what he said in the campaign, then there will be big trouble, not only for Israel, but also for the United States, because U.S. would isolate itself from the international communities.
We'll see what would happen. Of course, all of these are question marks. Wait until January the 20th or even a bit later for the answer. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Li Guofu, Rick Dunham, and Mayor Jevon Danfar. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From Yi Tianwei and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.